Hi there, my name's Andy Benson and I'm a Senior Education Officer at Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Bumblebee Conservation Trust's mission is to make sure all of our UK bumblebee species are thriving and valued, and it's to help you look after our bumblebees here in the UK. So I'm going to share with you a bit of information about bumblebees, why they're so fantastic, why they're so important, and then also at the end, how we can help bumblebees to thrive in the UK. So it might surprise you to know that we don't just have one species of bee here in the UK. In fact, we have around 275 species of bee. And those 275 species of bee can be split up into three different groups. Of the 275 species, one of them is the honeybee, and that's one that most of you will have heard of. Over 250 of them are what we call solitary bees. And they're the sorts of bees that live in your bee hotels, that sometimes live in the mortar between the bricks and houses, that dig little tunnels into the ground. There are lots and lots of different types of solitary bee. And then the bees that we're going to be focusing on mostly today, the bumblebees, there are 24 different species of bumblebee here in the UK, and I'll be introducing you to some of the more common ones in a second. Now, bumblebees are slightly different to other bees. And the bumblebee's story starts about 50 million years ago. And bumblebees first started to evolve in an area of Asia where the Himalayas and Mount Everest now is. And about 50 million years ago, two huge sections of the Earth, tectonic plates, started to slam together and force the land upwards, making the temperatures and the climate in that area get cooler and cooler. Now, the skinny and bald bees that lived in that area weren't really well equipped to survive in those conditions, so they started to adapt, they started to change. And the first thing they did was they started to get bigger and rounder, and that helped them hold on to more of their body heat. Then they put on a big winter jacket, again, keeping them warm in these cooling conditions. Now, from this area in Asia, bumblebees spread out all across Asia into northern Europe, and then across the Atlantic into North America, and down the spine of the Andes into South America. And now we have about 250 species of bumblebee all across the world. And what's really amazing is here in the UK, if you look at the UK on a world map, it's such a small island in comparison to the other countries and the other continents around the world. But in the UK alone, we've got 10% of the world's bumblebee species, 24 different species of bumblebee here in the UK. And that gives us a big responsibility here in the UK of stewardship to make sure that we look after the bumblebees we have here because they're significantly important across the whole world. So to introduce you to some of the species that we have, this is the buff-tailed bumblebee. And this is what we might say is a quintessential bumblebee. The bumblebee you might imagine when you think of one with black and yellow stripes and then that buff-colored tail in the back. And in fact, at this time of year in March, the bumblebees that first emerge are these huge buff-tailed bumblebee queens. Now, not all bumblebees are black and yellow striped. And for example, this common carder bumblebee is all ginger. It looks like a flying teddy bear. Another one of the early bumblebees to emerge is, as its name suggests, the early bumblebee. And that's got this tiny little red tail and just one yellow stripe across the top. Some of the bumblebees' names are much easier to remember, as they're just named after the color of their tails, like this white-tailed bumblebee, another common species. The red-tailed bumblebee, again named after that red tail, is showing some bumblebee behavior here. Now, people often worry about bumblebees because they can sting, and most bumblebees can sting. In fact, all female bumblebees can sting. And most of the bumblebees you see, the queens, all of the workers, they're all females and are able to sting. The male bumblebees that we see fewer of, they cannot sting. They don't have stings at all. But bumblebees, even though they can sting and they can be painful, they don't want to sting. And this bumblebee here is doing what all bumblebees do if you get too close to them. Like all insects, they have 6 legs. And on one side, they'll lift up their middle leg and they'll give you a little wave to tell you that you're getting too close and to warn you off. And most of the time, if you do end up getting any closer than that to a bumblebee, it will fly off before it even thinks about trying to sting you. All of the bumblebee stings that I've heard of in my time are from when people sit on them or put their hand in a glove that the bumblebee's in or something similar like that. Bumblebees really don't want to sting. Now, one of the great things about bumblebees, and one of the things that makes them such great pollinators, and we'll cover more about pollination in a little bit, is that the 24 species of bumblebee all have different lengths of tongues, which means that they like to feed from different types of flowers with different shapes. The garden bumblebee here has the claim to fame of having the longest tongue of all our bumblebees here in the UK. In fact, the garden bumblebee's tongue is the same length as its entire body. And bumblebees don't put their tongues away, roll them up like a butterfly does. A bumblebee's tongue is made out of material very similar to a fingernail, and the tongues are always sticking out. So they have to fold them down underneath their bodies while they're flying around and stick them out before they land on a flower so that they don't knock themselves off of the flower when they land. And the last bumblebee I'm going to share with you is called the tree bumblebee. Now, most of our bumblebees here in the UK, they like to nest either underground or near the ground. So a really common place for a bumblebee to nest is in an old rodent's nest, for example, an old mouse nest or a vole nest. Some like to nest in sort of long tussocky grass. In our gardens, we'll often find them in compost bins or under sheds or in steps or those sorts of things. But the tree bumblebee, as the name suggests, likes to nest in trees. And people will often find them if they've had a blue tit in a bird box the year before, and they'll often find that they'll have a tree bumblebee nest the year after. So those are some of our common species of bumblebee, and bumblebees have been loved and culturally important here in the UK for a really, really long time. And in fact, bumblebees haven't always been known as bumblebees. Way back in the past, they were actually known as humblebees because of the humming noise that they make as they fly around. And even before that, they had a different name. They were known as Dumbledores, known to be the inspiration behind the famous wizard in the Harry Potter stories. Now, a statement up on the screen now that might surprise you is that bumblebees don't make honey. This surprises lots of people when we tell them this. And in fact, of the 275 species of bee that we have here in the UK, only one makes honey, and that's the honeybee, as the name might suggest. Now, honeybees make honey because the only place where bees can get food from is from flowers. And in the winter time, there are not many flowers around. So during the spring and the summer, the honeybees will collect extra nectar from those flowers and store it in their hives in the form of honey, so that over the winter, the colony can survive by eating that honey rather than going out and looking for flowers. Now, bumblebees and other wild bees live their life slightly differently. They don't survive over the winter. Instead of living in hives, bumblebees live in nests. They make little wax pots and they fill them full of pollen and nectar. They lay their eggs in there. The eggs hatch into little grubs and they eat the pollen. They'll grow and grow. They'll spin themselves a silken cocoon, just like a caterpillar does. After a couple of weeks, it will emerge from that cocoon as an adult bumblebee. The workers will go out and forage, bringing back more pollen and more nectar until eventually the nest will make new queens. When that happens, all of that colony will die off, all of the workers will die off, the old queen will die off, and only the new queens will survive. They'll mate with some males and then hibernate over the winter. Now, because there are no bumblebees around during the winter time, there's no need for them to store nectar in the form of honey. So our wild bee species, including our 24 bumblebee species, don't make honey, certainly not the type of honey that we would buy from the shops, because they don't need to. So if bumblebees don't make honey, then why am I telling you that they're so important? Honey is a food source and often the reason why people keep beehives. But in fact, this word up on your screen now, pollination, makes bumblebees way more important than just making honey. Pollination is when an insect like a bumblebee transfers pollen from one flower to another flower of the same type. When that happens, that allows those flowers to be fertilized and allows them to create seeds and therefore new plants and new flowers. So bumblebees and other pollinators allow plants to reproduce. So that's great for the plants, but what about us? Well, if any of you have ever eaten an apple, that apple started off life as a single flower on an apple tree. That flower has been visited by a bumblebee, for example, that has visited another apple tree flower. It has fertilized it, allowed it to produce seeds. The petals have fallen off of that flower and the base of the flower has swollen up to become a juicy, fleshy apple. Okay. So pollination is important because it helps plants reproduce. The plants that reproduce, when they produce their seeds, often surround those seeds in a delicious and fleshy fruit or vegetable, as we call them. And we like to eat those. And in fact, about 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food that we eat require pollination from insect pollinators. And that one mouthful out of every three is usually the healthiest and most nutritious mouthful of food that we eat as well. And also in helping plants to reproduce and creating these seeds and these fruits, bumblebees are also supporting a whole web of life through the food chain. So the caterpillars and the snails and the mice and the rodents that will eat the fruits and the seeds, and the plants that are produced are then eaten by bigger predators, which are then eaten by bigger predators again. So our really important pollinators, the bumblebees and the other bees, are helping support our entire ecosystem and entire food web through the process of pollination. Now, even though bumblebees are incredibly important, they provide lots of food for us. Unfortunately, food for bumblebees has been disappearing at a really fast rate. In the last 100 years, here in the UK, we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows. In fact, probably a lot more than 97% of our wildflower meadows. So that's 97% of bumblebee food. And we've lost that because our environments have changed from farmlands that look like this with lots of flowers. Growing populations have meant that we've had to grow our towns and cities, losing green space. And the way that we farm and grow food has changed, meaning that we grow much bigger fields of one type of crop, meaning there aren't any flowers around for bumblebees to feed from. The good news is, even though bumblebees are facing those big problems, there are some really simple things we can do to help. And the number one thing we can do to help is to provide food for pollinators, provide food for bumblebees. Different shapes and sizes of flowers at different times of the year provide food for bumblebees. Bumblebees can only fly for around 40 minutes when they've got a stomach full of nectar, providing them with the energy they need to fly. So one small plant pot of flowers in your garden or on a balcony or on your school grounds can be a really good resource for a bumblebee as it's flying to and from the nest to find more food. Another really important thing is to avoid using chemicals such as pesticides when we do our gardening. Pesticides can kill bees directly if we use enough of them, but even if they don't kill the bumblebees directly, they can prevent them from navigating, prevent them from finding their way to food and from finding their way back to the nest, and it can stop them from reproducing as well. So we encourage everybody to avoid using pesticides. And lastly, and the most fun one for me, is leaving spaces to go wild. A corner of a garden, a space in the school grounds where we let the grass grow long, where we leave some piles of logs or some piles of leaves, create some really safe nesting spaces for bumblebees, and also safe places for them to hibernate over the winter. Now, speaking specifically about schools, there's something really fantastic that you can do in your school to help bumblebees, and that's become a bumblebee-friendly school. And Bumblebee Conservation Trust have launched the Bumblebee Friendly Schools Award, rewarding bumblebee-friendly actions taken in schools. The award is split up into 3 different categories. We've got bronze, silver, and gold. So schools can get started without committing much time or money into the project, and then build their bumblebee friendliness up, going from bronze through the silver award, and then eventually reaching the gold award. So if you want to find out more about supporting bumblebees, find some resources that you can use in school that are related to bumblebees, and find out all the information you need to make your school a bumblebee-friendly school, then visit bumblebeeconservation.org. Thank you very much.